Is it true that 183 years of the history of Islam have been lost? Where did they go? Why don't we have any original scripts of what was written about the Prophet's deeds and sayings, Sunnah, during his life? Or what was written during the reign of the 4 caliphs who ruled after the Prophet Muhammad? Why did the Arab Muslim rulers neglect those original scripts, despite having the power and money to conserve them? And if those original scripts ever existed, who destroyed them? Welcome, friends, to program with Shoaib Show. Welcome, friends, to With Shoaib Show. Our big question for today is it true that 183 years were lost from the early history of Islam without a trace? And that we don't have any original documentation of those years? And that every document we have was written after those 183 years? The answer comes from a very important, yet annoying to some, research report that confirms the loss of more than 183 years from the early history of Islam, while other research denies that fact completely. And as I always say, friends, review any opinion on this program does not reflect my total agreement with it. I might agree with some points and disagree with others. My main goal is knowledge, as I lay before you new ideas and new research. And if any of the audience is incapable of discussing new ideas, he will be annoyed by today's episode. We'll start with Iraqi Muslim researcher Dr. Nizar al-Haydari's article. I will try to address the most important points. The author starts by reiterating his main research questions about the early history of Islam. He denies that his purpose is to harass or inconvenience, especially towards Muslim clergy. But his questions are scientific and historical and demand some scientific and clear answers. Most Muslims strive to closely observe the Prophet's sayings, hadiths. They read those sayings from hadith books collected by the jurists Bukhari, Muslim and al-Tirmidhi, and others. They believe in those books without any doubt, even though all those authors were born around 150 years after the passing of the Prophet. How could they hear the Prophet saying all that? For example, the Prophet died in 11 A.H. according to the Islamic calendar. The jurist Bukhari was born around 183 years later. And he was born in Bukhara, Khorasan, today's Uzbekistan. That is, he was born after 172 years the death of the Prophet Muhammad, so how can he transmit hadiths from him? The jurist Abu Hussein Muslim, author of the hadith book, Sahih Muslim, which collected hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, was born 195 years after the death of the Prophet. He was also born in Persia, Iran now. The jurist Abu Abdul Rahman al-Nasai, author of the hadith book of Nasai, Sunan al-Nasai, was born 204 years after death of the Prophet, and he was born in Uzbekistan. The jurist Muhammad bin Isa, a.k.a. al-Tirmidhi, was born 198 years after the death of the Prophet, also in Uzbekistan. The jurist Abdullah al-Qazwini, author of Sunan ibn Majah, was born 198 years after, and in Persia, Iran, as well. None of those authors came from the desert of Arabia. This means that the Arabic language, the language of the Quran and Hadiths, was not their mother tongue, and this is strange and raises many questions. What's even more important is that they all lived 183 to 204 years after the time of the sayings and incidents of Prophet, that they recorded. Can you imagine how big that time gap is? It's as if someone came up to me and told me that someone else told them such and such happened 200 years ago. Am I supposed to simply believe that tale? I do not think, especially since it depends on the fact that there is a person who was quoted from a person for about 200 years. Especially since there are no original manuscripts of these hadiths, which were written during the reign of the Prophet Muhammad or even shortly thereafter. So why don't we have any original scripts from the Prophet's era to tell us what he said, and how he lived? The time gap starts from the first caliph who ruled after the death of the Prophet Abu Bakr, until the Caliph Muhammad bin Harun, who lived between the years 193 and 198 AH. And it should be said here that Islam at the time was not an oppressed faith by any higher authority, as opposed to early Christianity, for instance. Rather, there were Muslim rulers who ruled in the name of Islam, that is, it was not a persecuted religion, so manuscripts would disappear because of fear. Instead, Islam had 24 powerful Arab Muslim rulers, and none of them cared enough to keep any written record of the Prophet's life. As a Muslim, I find that very odd, and very confusing. So, was Muslim researcher Dr. Haidari right to believe that such manuscripts did exist but were destroyed by the Arab Muslim rulers? Of course, we cannot be scientifically certain, but if that was true, why did it happen? While, today we have manuscripts, artifacts and murals that date back to Samaria and Babel in Iraq, and ancient Egypt. And those are much older than Islam. Therefore, Dr. Haidari concludes that we cannot trust the above-mentioned Islamic hadith books without real historical documentation. Those were Muslim researcher Diani's Haidari's main conclusions. We have a different opinion. Mr. Mahmoud Jaber, he argues that, since the days of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims have known the Prophet's sayings. They have internalized them in their daily lives and recorded them. He adds that the Holy Quran compels Muslims to obey the Prophet's Sunnah, his speeches and actions. Says the Quran, take whatever the Apostle gives you, and relinquish whatever he forbids you. Muslims obeyed the Prophet and learned how to perform their rituals according as he was doing, and passed down those practices through the generations, just as they did with the Quran itself. The companions of the Prophet taught the people, they were also teaching them the Quran. None of these claims, with all due respect to Mr. Jaber, are supported by any scientific evidence. We don't have any historical evidence that this actually happened, and we don't have any manuscripts, as I said before. Mr. Jaber continues to argue that in the 1st century after Muhammad's death, at least 53 of the first generation of his followers did record and pass down the Prophet's Sunnah. In the 2nd century, around 99 did so. That, according to Jaber, confirms the documentation of the Prophet's teachings since the early beginnings of Islam. One of these early followers, for example, is companions of the Prophet Muhammad Said bin Jubair, born in 46 AH, who mentioned having documented the companion of the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abbas's narrations. Mr. Jaber continues to argue that it is a well-known fact that the Prophet's companions had read and circulated his written teachings among them. Mr. Jaber continues in fact, the youngsters among the companions, like Ibn Abbas, used to seek the elderly to write down what they narrated about the Prophet's Sunnah, prophetic sayings and actions. The jurisprudence Ibn Sa'd narrates how companion of the Prophet Ali ibn Abi Talib told his representative Ibn Abbas to use the Prophet's Sunnah in his debate with al-Khawarij, Ali's opponents. As an example of this early documentation of Sunnah, Mr. Jaber mentions the letters sent by Prophet Muhammad to the known kings and rulers around Arabia at the time. He adds that documenting the Sunnah was a state policy during the reign of the Umayyad Caliph Omar bin Abdulaziz, 99 AH, when he charged Sheikh Abu Bakr bin Hazm, the ruler of Al-Madinah and the most knowledgeable Islamic legislator of his time, to collect and write the Prophet's Sunnah, and documenting the Sunnah kept evolving after that point. Those were Mr. Muhammad Jaber's main arguments, and I will add the link in the description of the episode for you to read the whole article. It is important to say that my goal in presenting these different opinions is not to destroy the faith of any Muslim, for I am a Muslim, but I do not prefer that we obscure and hide this history. The goal is to know and try to find solutions. For it's my right as a Muslim, and the right of all Muslims to have scientific evidence that proves the revered story of their faith. Do we, or do we not, have authentic documentation of the Sunnah, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad? And with all due respect to Mr. Jaber, but he is basing his argument on narratives that lack any historical or scientific evidence. And by that, I mean some authentic and original manuscripts for those narratives, tablets, papyrus, parchments, etc. Some real artifacts like the ones we have from Samaria, ancient Egypt, or others. Mr. Jaber mentioned, for example, the Prophet's letters to the kings and rulers of his time, but has any neutral entity ever put one of those letters to the test to prove that it really came from the time of the Prophet? There is no scientific evidence that these letters were written during the reign of the Prophet Muhammad, and there are researchers in the history of early Islam such as Muhammad al-Masih who confirm that they are forgeries. For that, the conclusion is that we as Muslims do not have any scientific evidence so far, that the Sunnah of the Prophet, that is, the actions and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, was actually said and done. Therefore, it is difficult to consider it as part of the Islamic religion. Thank you, my friends. And I hope to see you all again in future episodes.